In this particular video, we're going to take a look at the colonial reaction to the Tea Act of 1773 and the consequences of their reaction to that particular law. If you recall, in prior videos, the Townshend Acts were the first set of acts that taxed tea. In 1770, following the Boston Massacre, you'll recall that Parliament repeals most of the Townshend Acts except for that particular tax on tea. Even though the next 3 years are relatively peaceful between 1770 and 1773, the colonists continue to resist this particular tax on tea. The colonists resist in 3 ways. One option is to continue to boycott British tea, and many colonists who are involved in the movement do actually boycott British tea. Some choose ultimately not to drink tea at all, just to abstain, and others choose to smuggle in cheaper tea from Holland, from Dutch merchants. In 1773, some things start to change with the British East India Company. The boycotts of tea almost bankrupt this particular company. They've got about 7 million pounds of tea sitting around rotting in warehouses because of the colonial non-importation agreements. Parliament wants to bail out the British East India Company. So they give this company a monopoly on tea in America. And I'll explain a little more about that here in a second. But I want you to know a couple of things about this decision before we move forward. The British East India Company represents most of Britain's investment in India, so this company absolutely cannot fail in the eyes of the British government. The other thing to remember about this particular company is that many members of Parliament have invested their families' entire fortunes into the company. So that's a second reason why they absolutely refuse to allow the East India Company to fail. So let's talk about components of this Tea Act in 1773 that they pass. So essentially, with the Tea Act of 1773, Parliament partially repeals the Navigation Acts. Prior to the Tea Act, the British East India Company had to ship all their tea to England first. The tea was sold at auctions to merchants in either Britain or from the Americas, who then shipped the tea across the Atlantic and sold to the colonies. So you get an increase in price by virtue of having to sell it to a middleman and the cost of transport because they have to make a pit stop in England. So the Tea Act essentially abolishes that part of the Navigation Acts, and it tells the British East India Company, instead of having these auctions in England, you can just sail directly to America and sell your tea directly to colonists. You don't have to sell it to a merchant or anything like that. So this cuts out quite a bit of cost for the British East India Company, and because it cuts out cost for them, it actually lowers the price of tea. But in effect, it gives the British East India Company a monopoly on the tea trade in the colonies. So ultimately, they have about 3 goals with the Tea Act. The first is to save the British East India Company from bankruptcy. Second goal is to put an end to the smuggling of goods, especially tea from Holland. And they want to get the colonists used to paying these taxes. They kind of want to end this whole argument about taxes. Of course, the colonists don't react favorably to the Tea Act. Parliament, yet again, underestimates colonial reaction. The colonists are furious. They view the tax as a trick. They think that by selling them cheaper tea, they'll trick them into paying these taxes they're opposed to, and it makes them angry. Your merchants especially are mad because they have problems with the British East India Company getting a monopoly on the tea trade. You got to remember, a lot of the merchants, those middlemen that we were talking about earlier, a lot of those merchants might be in the colonies. They might live right there, and so they're getting a portion of their profits cut. So we got a lot of mad people. The Boston Tea Party is the most prominent example of resistance to this law. It happens on December 16th, 1773. Most ports in the Americas, or in America, reject the tea and send it directly back to England. It doesn't even park in port. Boston, of course, is a different story. Lieutenant Governor Thomas Hutchinson, who we've heard his name many times at this point, he allows a ship called the Dartmouth to come into port and hang out in the harbor with all this tea. He is absolutely determined to enforce the Tea Act. So the Dartmouth arrives in Boston Harbor on November 27th, 1773. And I think, if I remember correctly, they got about 20 days to offload the tea and pay the duties on it, or get the boat out of harbor. So the colonists are begging Hutchinson, turn this ship away, turn it away. We don't want to pay for the tea. Please send it back. And he refuses. So on December 16th, there's a town hall meeting in Boston, and about 5,000 Bostonians are there. The Sons of Liberty tell these Bostonians that Hutchinson refuses to send the tea back. Around about 50 young men that night, many of whom are members of the Sons of Liberty, dress up as Mohawk Indians. They board the Dartmouth, the ship with all the tea, and they dump all the tea overboard into the harbor. Now, they're really careful not to damage any other cargo or anything on the ship. All they do is destroy the tea. Ultimately, by the time the night is over, they've destroyed 342 crates of tea, and this is worth about $4 million in today's money. So it was pretty destructive revolt. As soon as the British hear about the Bostonians' Tea Party, they're pretty furious. Even the colonist supporters abroad in Britain are pretty shocked by what the Sons of Liberty have done. They can't seem to understand why colonists are unwilling to buy cheaper tea for this obscure principle on representation. The British at this point start to see that this is not just about representation anymore. It's evolved into an argument over who has the power in the colonies. And the Crown and Parliament definitely see this. So in response, in early 1774, the Coercive Acts are passed. And the colonists refer to these as the Intolerable Acts. They are intended to punish Massachusetts for the Boston Tea Party, and they really only focus on Massachusetts. The Coercive Acts are a show of power to remind the colonies of who's in charge. It consists of technically 5 acts. In many American history classes, they only focus on 4. The first part of the Coercive Acts is that the Navy is to close down the Boston port by June 1st of that year to block trading in and out. So Boston is required to pay for that ruined tea before they'll reopen the port. The second act in the Coercive Acts is that they revoke Massachusetts charter, yet again, and they reorganize its government. The king appoints the leaders in governor's council, and the governor's council appoints judges within the colonies. So this is a kind of a big deal. He bans any town meetings except for once a year to conduct local elections. So they're not even allowed to get together at this point anymore. This next one is pretty inflammatory. Basically, they say that anybody who's working on behalf of the monarchy, and when you hear this phrase, think redcoats. So anyone who is working for the monarchy in the colonies who happens to kill a colonist and is charged for murder will be sent over to Britain for trial. They will not stand trial in the colonies. So Boston Massacre is still really fresh in the minds of Bostonians, and this particular act is really inflammatory. And then the last one that we're going to focus on is they enact a brand new quartering act where they have to house troops and provide supplies and things like that, food, for the troops. But there's one extra piece that's new. The governor can take any empty buildings that are around and requisition those or take those to house troops, to house redcoats. The colonists, as you can imagine, don't like the Coercive Acts. They react pretty strongly to these, and at this point, we are officially on the path to revolution. We're almost at the point where there's no turning back. Keep in mind that when we hit the Declaration of Independence, where the colonists air all their grievances against the Crown, out of the 27 grievances listed, 6 come directly from the Coercive Acts. So this is a really, really big deal. In the next video, we'll actually take a look at the colonists' overall reaction to the Intolerable Acts and how the other 12 colonies jump in to support the Bostonians.